morning. It's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you in front of the University of Rijeka, its rector and myself as vice rector. We are part now on 11th Scientific Colloquium, University of Rijeka. Scientific Colloquium is one project we started 4 seasons ago, and we try to cover all fields of science and art. And today's guest professor is Professor Andrew Williams from Barcelona, Spain. And the topic of his presentation will be demography and distribution. This presentation will be about 45 minutes, and after that we will continue with your summer school program of your summer school. I must say that all scientific colloquium of University of Rijeka are published in a season book. This is a book from last season of scientific colloquium. There are all presentations and some papers connected with the topic of guest professors. And at the end we have CD with presentations and movies if art is about, or something like that, with music and so on. So you can use this book and maybe have all presentations from last season. We have 4 scientific colloquium, and the next book will be published in November 2014. And now I would like to introduce Professor Williams, or maybe it's better before his presentation and the lecture, he will introduce himself, and after that he will start with.
Many thanks. Well, my name is Andrew Williams. I'm a member of the Philosophy and Law Group in Pompeu, Fabra University, for ICREA in Barcelona. I wanted to begin by thanking Elvio for organizing such a splendid colloquium. I've learned a lot already from our discussions, and I look forward to your remarks about to me. Let me say this is a road test that we've done. I haven't given this paper before, so apologies in advance if it's a bit rough and ready. As I said, I made some remarks on Monday as well. I have a tendency to mumble, so if you don't hear what I'm saying, just put your hand up and I'll try to make it a little more audible. My topic is, as the title says, demography and distribution. I'm going to focus just on one question that arises in this area. It arises because institution designers can distribute the costs of producing well-reared children in various feasible ways. My assumption is that children have an entitlement to a decent or a fair start in life. So our members of society have to invest in their upbringing to satisfy that entitlement. Doing so has costs. Those costs could be distributed across the members of society in various different ways by creating different institutions. Basically, we could subsidize the costs of the parent's decision to produce and rear a child in different ways. As a result of that, a question about fairness arises. What factors are relevant in deciding how well-designed institutions would set the price of parenting? That's a tremendously important question, because all sorts of characteristics of a society will be determined by that, including our very existence. The demand to produce children is elastic. If it be
If it cost something else to produce a child, people might have had other children. None of us might have been born. So it had a kind of momentous effect about the extent to which we substitute children. My aim is to cast doubt on one particular argument which people might think is relevant to the question. It's an argument that says third parties, that is, people other than the parents and the child, have an obligation to share in the costs of producing children when and because they benefited from children being created and well-raised. I'm going to cast doubt on that argument. My ambition is primarily negative then. Since many of the people who advance this argument are leftists who care about gender inequality and think that it's often an injustice, I'm going to try to argue that it's not necessary to advance this type of argument, an argument that subsidizes parental equality, in order to share that concern with gender injustice. So that's a little more positive remark that I'll make towards the end of my talk. So let me just go on now and draw two distinctions which are necessary, I think, in order to clearly understand the question that I'll be addressing. The first is the distinction between the production costs involved in creating and rearing children. These will arise in any human society that invests in children, and they arise simply because producing children has opportunity costs. Just as a family could choose to improve the quality of life of its existing members rather than produce new members, a society has a choice to make about whether to subsidize children. There are other ways in which it could have deployed the resources used to reduce the costs to parents of having children. We can distinguish between the production costs of children and the external costs of children. These are costs which don't automatically arise because they involve some third parties, people outside the family, being made worse off by the production of further children. During human history, children have often been undersupplied, and the creation of new children has been welcome, at least amongst the members of the group. It produces more people who defend the group. It produces more workers and people who look after their members, existing members, as they age. We've also got a human history where there are many religious views which often have a pro-natalist bias. As a result of that, the question about whether it's fair for people to produce children when it makes other people worse off hasn't really been addressed. I'm going to set that very interesting question aside. I'm going to assume that in the scenarios I'm talking about, there are no negative externalities as a result of producing and rearing children. The production of extra children is always, let's assume, of benefit to the existing members of society. The question is, how should those benefits be distributed amongst the existing members. Should institution designers try to reduce the costs to parents of their decision to produce and rear a child by forcing third parties to share in the costs of them realizing their ambitions? That's the kind of question I'm going to arise. The background assumption is doing so won't make those third parties worse off than they were prior to the existence of children. It's simply a question about how to distribute the benefits generated by the production of new members of society who've been well reared. There's a second question that we can look, there's a second distinction that we need to make to better understand my remarks. It's a distinction between two types of argument that might be seen as relevant for this question of the extent to which we should subsidize producing children. We can distinguish between pure incentive-based arguments for subsidizing the price of having a child and what I'll call fairness-based arguments. Pure incentive-based arguments are premised on the view that, as I said before, the demand for children is elastic. Right? People make a decision about whether to expand their family depending on how much that's going to personally cost them. And there's lots of empirical evidence to suggest that institution designers can influence people's reproductive behavior by reducing the price of having a child. After World War II, when various countries had population shortages, institution designers socialized the costs of having children in order to get parents to produce children that they might not otherwise have produced. That's a straightforward argument that might be used to produce children. And it might be an argument that's required by a concern with Pareto efficiency, a concern to make everyone better off. That's an argument I'm going to set aside, though. I'm going to look at cases where parents' preference to create a child and their willingness to rear the child well is robust. They won't prefer to do that more as the price of performing the activity goes down. But there's still a question about whether society should allow parents to pay the price. Some people say that because other people are going to benefit from parents producing well-reared children, then you shouldn't allow those other people to free ride, to derive those benefits without sharing in the costs of the parents having children. And they say that even if it's not necessary to motivate the parents to have the children, to spread the costs to the other beneficiaries. In other words, they think that institution designers should give parents a producer surplus, should pay them for having children, in effect, more than society needs to pay them in order to get them to produce and rear children well. And they should do that simply because it's unfair that other people who don't have children or who have fewer children benefit from their activities without sharing in the cost of performing those activities. That's the type of argument that I'm going to be focusing on. Now, let me develop one version of this argument. There's a problem in doing so because the literature on this kind of question, at least in political philosophy, isn't that well developed. One of my colleagues, Jose Luis, and I have a colleague in Pompeu, Fabra called Paula Casal, wrote a paper about this many years, quite a few years ago anyway, over 10 years ago. We also co-authored a paper in which we tried to construct an argument for subsidizing the price of having children by appealing to probably the most well-known argument within political philosophy, which prohibits a form of free riding. That argument appeals to Rawls's famous principle of fairness. So what I'm going to do now is just remind you about the content of Rawls's principle of fairness. I'm going to suggest that you can imagine somebody thinking that if you affirm this principle, you should also favour forcing non-parents to share in parents' costs where they benefit from the production of well-reared children. And then I'll restate the arguments that Casal and William are employed to refute that view. Then I'm going to focus on a recent critique of our view by another one of my colleagues. I'm sorry this is so in-house. Often the only people that ever write about my views are my friends. So that's because I continually paranda with my views. So what I'll do then is state Paul Sorrento's critique of our view, and I'll try to rebut that critique, and then finally say a little about gender injustice and how people who care about gender injustice are mistaken to think that they need to employ a fairness-based argument which is in favour of reducing the price of parenting. So that's basically the agenda. So now, the kind of dreary, slightly exegetical section. You'll remember that according to Rawls's statement of the principle of fairness, and I quote, a person is required to do his part as defined by the rules of an institution when two conditions are met. First, the institution is just or fair. That is, it satisfies the two principles of justice. Rawls is talking about his own principles. Second, one has voluntarily accepted the benefits of the arrangement or taken advantage of the opportunities it offers to further one's interests. Rawls uses this argument to justify an obligation to obey the law, and the thought is that at least some members of society willingly receive certain benefits about living in a law-abiding society, which are produced because other people accept an obligation to obey the law. As a result of that, it's reasonable for those people to demand that they do the same. Rawls offers an intuitive rationale for this general principle, which he states as follows. The main idea is that when a number of persons engage in a mutually advantageous cooperative venture according to rules, and thus restrict their liberty in ways necessary to yield advantages to all, those who have submitted to these restrictions have a right to similar acquiescence on the part of those who benefited from their submission. We're not to gain from the cooperative labours of others without doing our fair share. I think some people might find that principle attractive and the intuitive rationale. And they might say that it forms the core of a case for reducing the price of having children, parents, what the price parents take to have children. They might say, look, parents are bearing certain costs in order to produce children and rear them well. And as a result of that, other members of society who are not bearing those costs are receiving benefits. For example, just imagine two sets of individuals. One group forms families, they invest in producing children, and the other group saves the money which they might otherwise have spent on producing children. And in 18 years' time, then uses the money to buy the services which are offered by the children when they grow up and enter the labour market. The group of parents has produced something which is of great value to them, which wouldn't otherwise have existed, let's suppose. And it's cost the parents quite a lot to do that. Let's imagine that the children grow up and the adults grow even older and they eventually retire. Supposing there's a pension system, the children will be taxed in order to produce a pension fund, which will then, at least in societies like ours, be distributed indiscriminately to parents and non-parents. Once again, the non-parents will have received a substantial benefit as a result of the parents' activities. And you might think, because the parents have been labouring and other people are enjoying the fruits of those labours without contributing to the labours themselves. That's not fair. That's a form of exploitation. That's an objectionable form of free riding. That's the intuition that Casal and I tried to argue against in our original papers on this question. Roughly stated, our objection claims that the argument I've just mentioned is too indiscriminate. It fails to notice that the Rawlsian principle of fairness applies not to benefits in general, but a very specific class of benefits. And then the second part of our argument said that the kinds of benefits produced by parents in the standard ways aren't within that class. So I'm just going to try and elaborate that rather abstract statement. So roughly stated, we argue that the principle concerns, I quote here, non-excludable goods that are produced by cooperative activity in which individuals bear some cost which they would not otherwise bear in order to produce the good. So that there are two kind of features which support this claim that I've just made. One is just textual fit. If you look at the Rawlsian statement, you'll see that Rawls is actually talking about not kind of positive externalities which result from your activities in general. He's talking about beneficial effects to others which result when people engage in a cooperative venture according to rules that involve them restricting their liberty. The idea is in the case of the obligation to obey the law, for example, that people are accepting a normative requirement to take somebody else's commands as reason for action. So what they're doing is accepting a duty. As a result of them accepting a duty, other people receive a benefit. Moreover, them accepting that duty, as the quote says, is necessary in order to produce that benefit. That's why I think the final quote matters when it says, we're not to benefit from the cooperative labours of others. And the idea of a cooperative labour is the idea of labour that you perform out of a sense of duty, and you perform it with others in a way which involves having a shared intention to generate a certain type of benefit. Right? So that's the kind of view, I think, if we look very carefully at Rawls' statement, we'll see that he makes. Now, I am a bit of a kind of Rawlsian nerd, an anorak, who studies Rawls's text to probably an excessive and tiresome degree. But I think there are good constraints of charity, which suggests that if you understand the principle of fairness in the way I've recommended, the principle is more plausible. I think the idea behind Rawls is remark is that you don't. Well, I think the Rawlsian picture is this. Often when we act without any sense of duty, we'll have an outcome which is worse for everyone, or worse for a lot of people. If people recognize some duty, for example, a duty to obey a particular authority, then they can make themselves all better off. But they'll also often make other people who don't recognize the authority better off as well. And there's no way in which they can avoid doing that. The good that they produce, as economists say, is non-excludable. It's not either possible or feasible at sufficiently low expense to produce the good and to prevent other people who might not have contributed to producing the good from enjoying it. And then the thought is, those people have a choice. They could either withdraw from producing the good to prevent other people taking advantage of their activity. But that would be inefficient. That wouldn't really benefit anyone. Or they can regard themselves as having a right to force other people to share their sense of duty. I think the Rawlsian picture is that it's reasonable to regard people as having that kind of right, given that the good they produce is non-excludable. Now, the question for me really is not whether that principle is valid. Many people have rejected it. Maybe we'll have a conversation afterwards about whether the principle of fairness, as I've stated, is a plausible principle. But I think it has a lot of plausibility. Really the question is whether the principle could be invoked by parents. So I now want to focus more on that kind of descriptive claim and ask whether parents standardly can regard themselves as people who are engaging in cooperative labours from which other people benefit. It's certainly the case that parents can sometimes make that claim. I know parents who live in societies which are involving severe competition with other societies, other ethnic groups, who produce children simply because there's an ethos of producing extra children, even if it's not what you particularly want for your own personal family. That's a very radical case, but there are cases like that. It's also the case that we can imagine parents who inoculate their children in order to reduce the speed to which disease transmits to a population. They might do that out of a sense of fairness, not because they think it's in their child's interest. That's what would be most in the child's interest. It's free ride. I benefit from the advantages of living in an inoculated population, but not suffer the pain of the needle and any consequent costs. But they do it out of a sense of duty. So I don't want to say that parents can never be portrayed as as engaged in cooperative labour, which is necessary in order to produce a certain good. It's just that all the parents, virtually all the parents I know, I don't regard their activity in that way. They regard their decision to have a child as standardly morally optional. They didn't do it out of a duty to the general society, certainly. Even if they might think I have a duty to do it for God or for my grandparents, give them someone to Moreover, they're not doing it in cooperation with others. They usually take pride in the fact that they're doing it out of love. And they love one another, and they think it's a spontaneous expression of that love to produce a child, and they love the child. And that for that reason, they, rear the child well. So my thought is, amongst most of the parents I know, they can't be described as really engaged in the relevant form of cooperative labour, which triggers the principle of fairness and then justifies a right to acquiescence on behalf of third parties who benefited from that productive labour. So that's basically the kind of core argument about why the principle of fairness can't be invoked in order to justify reducing the price of parenthood because other people benefit. Much to my surprise, not everyone believes this argument. So Rijeka didn't believe it and wrote a recent critique of it in Philosophy and Public Affairs last year. Also, Rijeka makes two types of remark about our previous view. First, she says that we misconstrue in too demanding a fashion the relevant conditions which trigger the application of the principle of fairness. More specifically, she says that we overlook the fact that parents do pay a price to have children. Like just financially, it's very expensive to have children. Time-wise, it's very expensive. Secondly, she says, even if it's the case that parents don't intend that third parties are benefited from their children being well-reared, well-educated, motivated to work, it is nevertheless the case that they do intend these good things to exist. So it's not what we sometimes claim. One of the remarks we make is to compare engaging in a really pleasant activity, which somehow produces benefits for other people, and then which were a pure byproduct, which just hadn't been part of the agent's intention whatsoever. And she says, look, really, most parents aren't engaged in activity like that. They are paying a high price because having children is financially expensive. And secondly, even though they don't intend other people to be benefited, they do intend that things which are beneficial to other people exist. Well-cared for children, for example, who are going to be people with skills that other people want to buy. Now, she expresses some reservations, however, about the argument from the principle of fairness. She says two things here, basically. First, she says she has a nagging doubt that parents don't engage in cooperative labour, even though they're bearing costs and they intend to produce something which is of benefit to others. It's not true on Al-Sarati's view that parents standardly are motivated by a sense of duty. They're not like people who are obeying the law out of a sense of duty. And she thinks that that may make a difference to whether the principle of fairness applies. Second thing she says is that many of the goods produced by parents are in fact excludable goods. And to illustrate this, she asks us to consider the case of producing future taxpayers who will then fund our pensions if we live in a society with publicly funded pensions. Same applies in privately funded pensions, actually. The idea is that society makes a choice about how the benefits of that pension scheme can be distributed. As a matter of fact, it chooses not to exclude non-parents from the benefits. But it could have chosen otherwise. In principle, it could have just said, the fewer children you have, the smaller your pension will be. I know an Italian economist who argues precisely this, on incentive grounds. It's also the case, actually, that the German Constitutional Court, perhaps under pressure from the Catholic Church in Germany, in the early years of this decade, took seriously the idea that a woman who I think had 9 children and had spent basically all her life out of the labour market should nevertheless be regarded as working equivalent to other people because she produced something which really boosted their pension. So I think they pointed out that just as a matter of fact, we choose not to exclude people, but we could exclude people. So what I want now to do is kind of try to say why I'm not really convinced by Al-Sarati's critique. But before I do that, I should state her positive argument. Because as I said, she had these kind of reservations about the principle of fairness, because she thought that many benefits produced by parents were in fact excludable. So then she asks us to consider the benefit of producing future taxpayers who fund the pension system. And she advances what she calls the socialized goods argument. The idea here is that there is a cooperative scheme which involves everyone being motivated by duty, which distributes the good that parents have produced in a particular way. Like the idea is basically that we all obey a set of norms which results in the pension contributions being distributed in one way rather than another way. The thought is that this is a kind of cooperative scheme which is one where people are animated by duty. And that type of scheme is fair only if it responds to the fact that parents have been engaging in some productive activity. And that activity should be acknowledged when we make distributed decisions. We could do it in the way that some people have recommended by giving bigger pension contributions to parents, bigger pension entitlements to parents. But also ICREA doesn't favour that. Instead, she says, the society should instead acknowledge the contribution of parents to the production of the pension fund by reducing the costs of having children, by subsidising parental activity. So that's a positive argument. What I want to do now is briefly say why I'm not convinced by various remarks she makes, and I'll produce a counter-example for this positive argument. The crucial thing for me is that when also ICREA says that she has a nagging doubt about whether parents are engaging in cooperative production, that's really exactly what our critique is all about. So it's not the case that she's rejected our critique by making this point and then made a new criticism of our own. Our thought, which is pretty apparent if you look at the quote that I gave earlier, which says that it's important that parents are engaging in cooperative labour and therefore are bearing a specific kind of cost, namely the cost of submitting to duty, consequently have a specific type of intention, namely a shared intention with others to produce a good. That's the kind of key point that we're making. So I don't think really that ultimately she is rejecting our argument. The real question for us is whether the price to pay for having a right that other people share in your costs is that you are moved by a sense of duty. And my thought is still that parents are not moved by a sense of duty when they create children and they care for them. But then, as I said, there's this other aspect in ICREA's view, where she says, look, that we're all moved by a sense of duty when we contribute to a cooperative scheme that distributes the costs and benefits of producing and children in a particular way. And then she says, look, it's just not a fair way to do that in a way that doesn't acknowledge the productive activities of parents. And so that's a socialized goods argument. So I want to just ask your opinion about one potential counter-argument here. Imagine that you live in a street of houses and your neighbours are rather house-proud. They decorate their properties, and generally as a result of that, the street looks really kind of nice. Consequently, the property values and the rental values in the street are higher than they otherwise would be. You can rent your front room out at a higher price than you would because of what they're doing. Your property, let's imagine, is the only shabby one, like mine, in the street. There's a cooperative scheme which distributes the effects of their house-proud activities. We could imagine that the city council sends somebody around to look at how well tended people's houses and front gardens are and then when it's deciding how much to tax properties, gives an exemption to people who got well-tended houses that they can then use to buy the paint, cover the labour that they deploy to create this good which you're benefiting from. Let's imagine that the people they employ don't cost any money and they can do this freely. The question is whether they're required to do that, or whether there are positive reasons for them to do that. And my conviction is no. It's just another one of these cases where we can benefit from what other people are doing without necessarily having to share in the costs they bear. I think that's plausible in this case because I'm assuming that these people just don't keep the house looking good out of a sense of duty. We didn't all get together and think, look, we can all be better off if we acknowledge a duty to improve the front of our houses, thereby increasing the property values and rental values. It's just something they like doing. And as a result of this, I get a benefit which I wouldn't otherwise get. It's not necessary for us to have a cooperative scheme to get people to do this because they spontaneously like doing it. So for me, this is a case of a phenomenon which is pervasive in society. We often benefit from other people who are acting in ways which may well have costs to them. But we don't have to share in those costs because they're just not doing it out of sense of duty. So that's basically my counterexample to the socialized goods argument. I think that in the case of the socialized goods argument, it's like this because the parents' productive activities are not animated by a sense of duty. The parents are animated by a sense of duty when they conform to the general distributive scheme, which chooses to distribute the pension fund in an indiscriminate manner. But everyone's motivated by that sense of duty. There's nothing special about parents here. So that's the objection. Let me now, very briefly, I think I just have 2 minutes left to say why you shouldn't be too worried about my conclusions. I said that many people on the left, feminists who care about gender equality, have used something like the public goods argument. The most notable example is an economist called Nancy Pompeu, who's used this argument. The thought is that we can now justify transferring resources to parents, and that will benefit women who tend to engage in more parental activity than men. Or it'll at least make women work better off than they otherwise would be. Al-Saraki says that's plausible, and she welcomes this kind of view because she thinks that it provides an argument for doing something that may reduce gender injustice, but which doesn't rely on what she thinks are very contentious claims about what makes inequality between men and women unfair. So I had precisely the opposite reaction to this. I think that the argument from the principle of fairness and the socialized goods argument, on reflection, are really very contentious because there's a division between us about what we think is the normative significance of creating a positive externality. People like me think that it only generates duties under very specific cases, which stand in the absent and apparent cases. But I think it's relatively easy to argue that women are, in our society, the victims of inequality and opportunity. I do that within a Rawlsian framework. Imagine you think about the Rawlsian principle of fair equality of opportunity in the labour market. Imagine that you recognise that your success in the labour market depends upon the support you receive from other people. We think that in the case of where there are class-based inequalities in the funding that goes into people's education, we think that the fact that affluent people's children have better funded education and that equips them with a head start in the labour market is an unfairness. You're Rawlsian, you think that there should be publicly funded education which does something to offset that. But I think that there's an inequality in which is comparable in the marriage market. If you're a male looking for a partner who's supportive, it's really easy to find one relative to the position of women, because men will find it easier to find women who want to have a gender egalitarian distribution, or even be primarily homemakers. And that'll equip you well in the labour market. If you're a woman, however, it'll be more difficult to find that type of partner. And as a result, employers will anticipate that you'll be a less reliable worker. It'll be you, if you're a woman, who's more likely to have to go and pick up the kid from school when the kid is sick, because you will be less likely than a man to be able to convince your partner that you should split that task 50-50. That's just an empirical assumption, but I think it's a very plausible empirical assumption for which there's sociological evidence as well as familiar anecdotal evidence. So my view is that people who are concerned about gender injustice and want to address this problem should look to Rawls when they try to construct arguments which would be advantageous to women. But they shouldn't look to the principle of fairness, because that doesn't, I think, supply a very plausible argument for reducing the price of parenting. Instead, what they should do is look to another element in the house that Jack built, namely the principle of fair equality of opportunity. Okay, well, I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
You will continue with your summer school, but now I will give some to our guest professor for one certificate that you may run this presentation. This certificate is in English and also in Croatian. Maybe sometimes you will come in Croatia and learn something.
I should do it. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. I will give you also a monography of our university. It's in Croatian and English, and also opportunity for you to learn some Croatian words. And this is a book from our scientific colloquium. I will contact you with email. I need some information from you, and I will give you one quote with a logo of our university. And thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentation. I must say that I am a parent. I have 3 sons, and after these presentations, I have a lot in my mind. I'm sorry I will not be part of discussion. Maybe I will think about that and ask you something later. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
I will also take one photo for this book.
I'd like a copy of the book.
Yes, you will receive the book. Yeah, always. And I must say that Professor Baccarini always suggests very good guest professors, and I hope that this will continue. Thank you very much. I will leave you now and you can continue the discussion.
José and Anna's children.
Now that they have the most questions, I have to. Okay. We're not having the discussion now?
Now we're José, comments, and then coffee break, and then discussion.
Oh.
Do you have a pen to write something on the blackboard?
On the way. I will bring it.
So that's, I'm in a terrible situation. I don't have an excuse to say that this topic is totally new to me or I've never heard about it. So many chances to discuss it, right? But I still feel that I don't have even a considered position, right? To the judgment. So, and so the Andrew's paper is also short, so I don't have also the excuse of saying, oh, there is a very but it's quite, at least to me, I found it difficult. It's a technical argument trying to reject Citizenship's objection and so on. And the truth is that I feel that I don't have that much to contribute to that discussion, right? So I want to try, except for one very tiny. But so let me just try to put a couple of things, or 4 things to be exact, on the table, and then maybe Andrew may want to say them before just having the open discussion. So I think so the argument, the first argument is presupposed, has many assumptions. One of them, as Andrew explained, is an argument that depends on a more general argument, which is the benefits argument. Right? So the idea is one of the assumptions is non-parents are benefiting from the production of these children. So as I see it, let me try to make a very simple scheme. So people have a choice. Let's say, we could also discuss this, but let's assume that people have a choice of parents or non-parents. Right? We don't need to presuppose that choice is totally free or something, but in any case, it's a choice at some point, that's one of the assumptions. And then I think the argument goes by assuming, that's not exactly explicit, but I think it's necessary to assume that the parents, those who have chosen to have children, in general, Andrew said, in general, all the parents that we know, in general, are willing to pay the costs of producing children. Right? So we have here a moment of production, let's say, in which these parents engage in costs, right? And they do it willingly. Right? But we also, we can also assume that these parents have benefits of producing children. That's one stage of the process. Then, so the argument needs to presuppose also that in a, let's say, in a later moment, right, these children that are taken as goods in this terminology, right, and will be, the expression is very ugly in this context, but will be exploited. These goods can be exploited for the society and can produce things for the society. I won't use the word exploitation because it's terrible, but let me say, so these children are supposed to produce effects in the society. And I guess that you can see it, that these effects, some of these effects will be costs and some of them will be benefits. Right? Again, I think that the argument needs to presuppose that the net balance of these costs and benefits is positive. Right? So, when we produce children, we are generating a net balance of benefits for the society. Non-parents are part of the society, and then they are taking part of these benefits. That's the argument, in short. Right? Maybe not exactly one half of these benefits, but they are benefiting, they are taking advantage of the production of these benefits. Right? I think that you can also consider that non-parents have, so their choice of not being parents, producing them some costs and some benefits. I mean, they can save money because they don't need to invest money in raising children, in rearing children, but they also incur some costs, maybe some costs of opportunity, or maybe they will have some pleasant lives, I don't know, right? But you could assume that they have also some costs. And I think that the argument, that's not so clear, but I think that the argument also presupposes that the choice of being non-parents needs to be, the net balance of these needs to be positive. Because if it's not, right, needs to be needs to be non-positive. So the net balance will be also positive. Because only then you can say that those who chose not to be parents, right, they took some benefits in the net balance of that choice. And they are also benefiting of the decision of those who chose to be parents. Right? And they are benefiting twice, and only then you can raise the concerns of birth. Right? Okay. And I still said nothing about the net balance of these. I think that you don't need to presuppose that the net balance of this is negative. You don't need to presuppose that, but I think that part of the debate is as if the net cost of this production is negative. Because if it's not negative, because the idea is then, according to the argument that Andrew is discussing, the idea is these non-parents, are taking unfair advantage of the benefits produced by the children of those who chose to have children. And that's why they should contribute to pay the costs of production. And I think, again, I don't think that you need to presuppose that the net balance of this production stage is negative, but I think that it's plausible to presuppose that it is negative, and that's why they should contribute to pay these costs. Because otherwise, if the net balance of this part of production is positive, I don't really see why the parents should have even an extra claim to call for help to non-parents to help them to pay these costs. Right? So the first thing I want to say is all this scheme is not really clear. I mean, I'm quite puzzled about the idea that you can make all these estimations and calculations. Right? That you can aggregate all those costs and benefits and then take a final position about whether this is costly or non-costly, whether this is produces a net benefit or not. I mean, that's a real puzzle that I have. So it's not totally clear to me that this is an easy thing to do, or even a possible thing to do. Right? And this is, of course, presupposed by the argument. I mean, if I were right, and this is impossible, it's impossible to estimate all these costs and benefits and so on, then there would be a more economical way of rejecting the argument, and so that would be good for Andrew as well. But that's only my initial puzzle. The real first comment is that in my intuition, I will not be capable of articulating this in a fully understandable way. I have an intuition, and I will give you an example to try to show what my intuition is. But my intuition is that when we are making all these estimations, all these balances and so on, we are aggregating costs and benefits that are very different in nature. Right? And I'm not so sure that that is actually good, right, for the idea. So trying to say something in favor of the benefits argument, right? Something I would say is the following. Maybe, let's see if Andrew can concede it or not. You could say there are different types of costs, right? Let me just give you two examples. Let me just give an example of two types of costs. So one of the costs of production is certainly that of education. That is probably one of the first examples that come to our minds when we think about this issue. So the parents or someone needs to pay for the education of kids, and that's a significant cost. That's one type of cost. Quite a different type of cost is, I don't find a better expression, providing, let's say, happiness. I'm hesitant to use this word. My alternative was amusement, which is not good too. So, giving kids birthday parties, nice weekends on the mountains, hiking, or I don't know, going to the beach in summer, whatever, right? So this is a cost. This cost of rearing children certainly produces a benefit for the society, because I think that we all benefit from the fact that children are happy, right, and have happy childhood. But I take it to be totally different. I mean, for the sake of the argument, I think that it works in a totally different way to the cost of education. And that's where I think that the nice houses in the straight example that Andrew gave against Serena's idea of socialized goods can apply. So I think that the example of the nice houses that Andrew just explained apply nicely to this idea of the cost of providing amusement and happiness. That is, parents in principle, not all, unfortunately, not all parents are willing to do that, but normally parents are willing to provide happiness and amusement to their kids. Right? And they are happy to organize birthday parties and things like that. And so they are willing to do it. They will do it anyway, so that is the robustness part that I was mentioning. And we might benefit from this fact. But I agree with Andrew, the fact that they are willing to do it, and the fact, but especially the fact that we are benefiting from it, doesn't, from this fact, doesn't follow necessarily that we should contribute to the costs of these kind of activities. Right? But to my mind, and that's just an intuition, sorry I cannot articulate it better, but my intuition is that when we deal with education, we are dealing with a totally different case. Why? Well, I think that we all have a strong interest in the children of our society being very well educated. Yes, part of this interest derives from the fact that we will receive future benefits from this education. But I don't think that's the only part of this interest. I think that we have a fundamental interest in the children of our society getting the better education possible, which is independent of the future benefits that we can receive in terms of better pensions or whatever. Right? That's my intuition. So that's one worry I have. And then I think that if you disaggregate different costs and benefits, perhaps some version of the benefit argument would work. A sophisticated version which could be combined with this idea of having a strong interest in covering certain costs. That's my first comment. And then very quickly, just 3 comments that are external, let's say, to Andrew's argument that maybe he might be willing to say something about. So, first, the decision of having children or not having children can be determined or influenced by institutional and political decisions, as Andrew actually proposes, and in this paper and in previous papers. Right? So the state can make some decisions, giving incentives. That's an argument that he doesn't consider incentive-based argument. The state can give incentives both to have children or not to have children. So So there are certain positions that could influence this previous choice. Right? So imagine now that we live in a society in which we as members of the society, we have decided to authorize the people to make totally free the decision of having children, right? With no incentives either for having children or for not having children. And it might be the case that we are conscious that this will have some consequences in terms of costs and benefits for the society and for both those who decide to have children and those who decide not to have children. But regardless of all that, we might have independent reasons to say we authorize the people, we as a political community, we authorize the people to make this decision in a totally free way. Right? I think that's the case when the society doesn't prohibit having children or doesn't constrain having children as a means of time, right? But it doesn't give incentives, as in most of our countries, to those families which have a lot of children. So the case of Spain, I know the situation in Croatia, but in Spain, the families with 3 or more children have a lot of subsidies and privileges and social benefits. Right? But if you don't have either of these, none of these things, then it might be the case that the society is authorizing parents to make this choice. And if that is the frame of the question, then all the rest of the considerations are totally irrelevant. It's irrelevant whether these will generate benefits or not, whether these will benefit to some or not, etc. Everything comes from a previous decision of the society to say that should be a free choice. It's independent to say, to protect this area of choice and say everyone should feel free to make this decision in a free way. Okay, and finally, just one last thing. I will skip the other one. So what about, so all these, and as I said, this is totally external, right? So all the considerations that Andrew raises here are relative to this argument of benefits and the argument of fairness. And so all these presupposes that we can handle this question from, let's say, cost and benefits analysis for people, right? And let's say a subjective or satisfaction of preferences analysis, right? But what about impersonal values, right? Both for and against the decision of having or incentivizing having children. So we might have, for instance, and perhaps I will sympathize with that, we might have reasons depending on the personal value of protecting the environment to try to incentivize, to make more difficult to people to decide to have children, right? And incentivize the decision of not having children. That would be, again, totally independent of all this here. But on the other side, we might have reasons, impersonal reasons derived from the personal value of having more human beings in the world, right? In order to say we should not actually put negative incentives in the decision of making children or producing children, because when someone produces children, a child is adding value to the world, right? I don't know. I mean, this is totally out of your argument, but you might be willing to say something also.